Hello, and welcome to Semantic Reactions, the official podcast of the Institute of General Semantics. My name is Ben Haug, and I'm pleased to be able to introduce the 24th installment in our ongoing series. For our August episode, Corey Anton and Thom Gencarelli joined IGS President Lance Strate to talk about general semantics and politics, based on the recent special issues of the IGS's quarterly journal, etc., a review of general semantics. Their discussion deals with Corey Anton's role as guest editor, working together with Thom Gencarelli as editor-in-chief, and their plans for publishing an anthology based on the two issues. Naturally enough, their conversation also covers Alfred Korzybski's historical development of time binding and how general semantics has been and could be applied to politics. They also had much to say about contemporary American politics, media and technology, and the current presidential election campaign. Let's listen in.
Well, hello and welcome to another episode of Semantic Reactions, the official podcast of the Institute of General Semantics. My name is Lance Strate, and I am here with my fellow trustees, Corey Anton and Thom Gencarelli, to talk about politics. And this is specifically about the two special issues that were just published, two special issues of Etc., a review of general semantics, our official journal, that were guest edited by Corey Anton under the guidance of regular editor Thom Gencarelli. That's why these guys are here. And their plans for what will happen next. But I want to start with you, Corey, and because it was your idea to do this special issue, which expanded into two special issues. What were you thinking?
Well, Wowie, thank you very much, Lance. I really appreciate you inviting both me and Thom in to talk with you about it. So, I mean, it really came from attending conferences where we were talking about general semantics. And I think if anyone goes to the Alfred Korzybski Memorial Lecture, you know, there's a lot of people there who are, you know, fairly informed, and they're saying things to me like, given all the turmoil that's happening, given all the, you know, the political unrest, why aren't more general semanticists saying things that are helpful or giving resources and tools and just helping sort of create an adequate space for the kinds of discussions that need to go on? And I get to use Korzybski's sense to become more scientific about it and hopefully bring some sanity along the way. And I do believe that there are incredible resources in general semantics, not only, I guess, for like in my work, I was trying to do, you know, help bring Korzybski's ideas out, bring them up to date, and help people shape their own self-understanding. So I didn't see mine as much as like direct policy in the way that I saw others that were more, you know, more focused. And, you know, there's obviously, let me just say this, I'm very happy with the collection. You know, I did put out a call and I got abundant response, as you suggested. It did turn into two issues. And, you know, I think
which shows that there is a great interest in this topic.
It's exciting too. I think the range is good. I think they all seem to be level-headed and reasonable, and you know, they're trying to get out of the ridiculously over partisan orientations. I mean, I think that's one of the real benefits of a general semantics orientation. I think there's a whole bunch of stuff that I would like to talk about, but I thought maybe I would ask Thom if he would want to, you know, because he was very supportive when I brought up the issue, and he had suggested that, you know, it might be worth putting out a call, and we are talking, you know, we're hoping to put together an edited collection from it, because we do feel, I think, quite solid about the way it all came out. But I don't know if Thom, if you wanted to say something.
But you mean a co-edited between the two of you?
Oh, I would co-edit the book. That's right.
Yeah, and it seems like we've maybe got another couple of submissions since we put this out that are on the subject too. I mean, to me, forget about looking at the things that have been going on within the United States in the last bunch of years. But if you're looking, you know, from a transnational point of view, how can we not be addressing, you know, global political economic issues? How could we not be offering what we as a, you know, collective have to offer to the conversation with again, the idea that we're going to help. And you know, it's funny, as we were preparing to do this, you know, I went back to the issues and I reread Corey's original introduction in the first issue. And he asks, a whole bunch of questions about how GS can help and whether it can. And two of the things that struck me, one was the question whether GS really is apolitical, right? Rather than to have a particular politic or to take a particular stance, whether the nature of what it is we do would mean that we're open to thinking about things in all kinds of ways and then, et cetera, trying to continue to make sense of it in the ways that we possibly can. The other, and I'm actually going to read this one, the question, could different people bring the same principles of GS to an identical issue only to reach very different conclusions regarding the nature of the issue and how to best handle it? Right? Again, these questions, and you asked a lot in the course of that introduction. These questions really stuck out to me. And the thing that I thought of at the end of this reread was to say, with respect to the idea of time binding, are general semanticists naturally progressives? And I don't like labels. I don't like to label myself. I don't like to label us other than to talk about us as, GSers. But thinking ahead based upon what we know and what we've learned, does that make us by nature progressively oriented, progressively minded? So I think that these are really interesting questions as a launching pad.
Yeah, no, that's good. I think maybe to just follow out some of that, Tom, it's like, I really do. I would like to advocate that people focus more on policy than on personality politics. And personality politics is sort of what happened in recent years with, the image culture and all this kind of other stuff. And focus on policy just seems boring. And it's not really aligned with the kind of new digital orality that's afoot, that's very antagonistic, all this kinds of other things. But then I start to ask myself, is it possible to have really robust policy discussions that are low level of abstraction? Or doesn't it become like you're going to have to incorporate so many different kinds of facts with any particular policy? And then it starts to become like, again, I'm not sure if, it was sort of like alluded to in Lance's, essay on this problem of the liquidation of facts themselves becomes, potentially there as people can't really agree upon what a fact is, as everybody goes, well, that's just your opinion, because there's just so many different particulars that do have to be addressed. And I think sometimes general semantics, it's billed more as like a practical epistemology for a person in their world where you can point to something. But what are you pointing to when you're pointing to a policy? There's all this, the devil's in the details. There's all these different ways in which it's how it's going to get shaken out and implemented. And, let me just maybe another way into this is when there's all this concern about AI generated images and what's fake and what's not. And are there going to be misrepresentations? For me, it was so fascinating that one of the first real major examples that happened, and it just happened in the last few weeks, was the picture of this crowd outside Kamala Harris's plane, and Trump said this was AI generated, and then the fact checkers said no, it wasn't. And so it's now like the truth and lies are so interchangeable that it isn't happening as I first imagined, which would be someone's going to create something fake and make people believe it's real. No, instead, people were able to take something's real and try to convince people that it's fake.
But there have been like robocalls with fake that have been audio fakes of Biden and others like that have been. And in fact, that's been a criminal trial on I believe.
I don't disagree with that. I guess what I'm trying to say is that it's interesting how much our focus has been. I think media scholars in general has been on the way what's not real will be pawned off as what is real. But I think we're starting to see the reversal there, which increasingly even things as factual as an unaltered photograph can be dismissed as fake because of the potential of AI. That is, the more that people realize the potencies of AI systems, the more they're able to go, I just can't trust anything I see. So it probably is fake because the person who I agree with said so.
It's interesting. You used the phrase before, digital orality, which is kind of, an extension of Wang's idea of secondary orality. And when, you talk about a robocall with, using someone's voice print, right? That's digital orality. But when you start to talk about pictures and moving pictures, right? Well, wait, that's not secondary orality anymore, because the imagery and the ways in which we can create fake imagery is not something like you and I looking at one another right now on Zoom as we have this conversation, right? So, what do we call that? What do we refer to that as? And obviously, we're really on the precipice of the kind of video deep fake where all bets are off with respect to, what is real, how real is real, right?
I mean, I was sort of riffing on Andre Murr's use of the term in his fairly recent, like the 2024 book on the rearview mirror and that Jasper's axial age and Logan's alphabet effect. That's actually a very good book. I was impressed. I mean, I think he's doing some really great stuff there. But his discussion of it was very resonant with Lance's piece. I mean, there's different ways in which these new social media sites and things like YouTube and TikTok and just all these audio visuals, they're changing the way that people use language. It's not a propositional discourse. It's not, I think that's one of the things that's sort of interesting about Trump is Trump uses language very differently than I think most presidents have before. That is, most presidents were so steeped in a literate tradition that they were speaking in terms of facts and giving propositions and assertions. Certainly there's going to be biases and ways in which they're, not being fully unpartisan, but I think Trump, he just uses language in a different, more oral sense of it's about identity. It's somewhat exaggeration, or it's very cliche. Like he tried to just take a bunch of things he said about about Biden and just carry it over to Harris. And it didn't matter. He wasn't really talking about either of them. He was just sort of giving they're dumb and they're evil and this this kind of stuff.
But rather than talk about personality, let's go back to your point before about a policy, right? I guess the issue from a general semantics point of view, when we start to talk about policy is, how much do I know? How much do I understand? I'm not a political scientist. I'm, a politically engaged, active, astute person, but there's so much that I don't understand. So that when we have a conversation about policy, from my point of view, it's intentional. It's based upon what I know. And I have to turn it into an extensional endeavor and ask people to tell me what I don't understand and what I don't know. And that, as we start to talk about policy, that just seems endless, right? Any one particular policy issue itself is endless.
Let me just try to bring it back to, though, because you're saying policy, and you brought up, Thom, earlier the question of progressive quality. And of course, the term progressive, while it has particular associations with sort of left-wing or liberal politics, I mean, it comes from the word progress. And so if we go back to, and I do think a lot of this starts with Manhood of Humanity, with Korzybski's first book. And we see in that book a very clear political program that he's advocating for. And so if we think of progressive as meaning based on progress, that we can make progress, then that does suggest a connection to science in particular. I mean, there's a connection to technology as well, but based on science. But the thing is that if we proceed scientifically, which is really, was Korzybski's kind of continuity as he shifted from manhood to science and sanity. That if we think about science, there is this concept of truth. It may be contingent and always open to reality checking and updating, but still there's this idea that, based on what we know now, there is one best way of understanding things, one best explanation for things, that we have competing theories, but one best fits the facts. And so when it comes to policy, if it were to employ a truly scientific approach, wouldn't that kind of be the end of policy debates in a way? If we were thinking about a general semantics approach to these things, because if we could determine these are the facts, this is the approach that best works with these facts, and has the best support of these facts, wouldn't that wind up with a kind of technocratic approach to government, the kind of view that Jacques Ellul was so critical of, where there no longer is any real political debate because in a sense, the technocrat has determined that this is the most efficient way, say, to combat inflation, or the most efficient policy to guarantee democratic elections, or, whatever the problem is, that there must be one best way to approach these things if we approach it from a scientific methodology.
I guess I'm sympathetic to that series of claims, partly because if you take some very difficult, intractable problem, say like homelessness, you're going to get the chain network of all the different kinds of things and the different kinds of policies that are going to come in. And then those are going to be filtered through all kinds of value systems, like how much agency do I think the person had, how much public responsibility, how much private responsibility. So there's going to be all these other side assumptions that are going to filter, shape, and make more contestation over the policy.
Homelessness, I would bring up the immigration issue, right?
Yeah.
The transnationalism of what is going on in other countries that creating a problem of immigration into this country, where we, in the United States, think about it as our problem. But no, it's, the diaspora of peoples leaving places all over the world and trying to go to other places, better places, for themselves and their children. Again, to me,
that's great. Because take something like, what could be more of an example of confusing the map and the territory than being a nationalistic going, somehow I'm an animal and I'm claiming that this is the border that separates us off as humans and as beings. Some of it's very arbitrary and questionable from a scientific perspective.
So what do we conclude from that then?
I would say David Bohm, he was a physicist, his book on dialogue is must reading. Everyone should have to read it. I think we need to be able to create not only the space for dialogue, but give people the tools of general semantics to help them in wrestling with particulars. And at least if we're on policy and we're talking about policy, we may find places where we can be strategic and find like, wow, maybe we're, not as in much disagreement as we thought. But I think as long as we're going to talk about personality and likes and dislikes of people and all this kind of stuff, I think it just goes nowhere.
Mm-hmm.
But I think there's still merit to having discussions about policy. It's just policy is a much more difficult thing to get into. And I do think people get, to use David Bohm's expression, they feel things are necessary. And once they hit this wall of, no, this is absolutely necessary, they're like a value system in there that they're not willing to budge with. And now it becomes very difficult. Right.
So that's sort of the bottom line then. Is policy a matter of values? Or is it, can there be a scientific approach that says this is the best way to approach this problem, and so any other way would be a mistake?
Yeah, no, that's a problem. That basically is like Taylorism and Skinnerian, racial.
Yeah.
Some of that becomes like highly reductive. I think we need something like the balance of the irrational and rational. And even to say those are just more dichotomous words coming out of my mouth. We need to see the whole human being, and the whole human being in their real environment is more complex than any of the boxes we can sort of, verbally create for ourselves.
I just think, the coming to consensus, decision making the right and best decision. Granted, Lance, maybe it does come down to values, and I don't think most people necessarily, are cognizant of their own values, recognize, really look into their own value systems enough. But I just, in all of this, I think of Stanley Fish, once saying that, that people outside of the world of the academy in which the three of us work don't understand that, sitting around and talking about something is actually doing something. And if we can have conversations and really listen to each other rather than, stake our claim based on our values, that's an important step that I don't think in the greater scheme of global politics or domestic politics, we're not there.
Yeah, I think that is more desirable. What you're talking about is very desirable. But I guess we could haggle for less and say something like, look at the difference between trying to create a policy about abortion versus trying to create a policy about term limits. And I think if you reach across the border, there seems to be a lot more people who are in agreement that term limits really makes sense. Now, there's some opposition, but nothing in the way that you get deep trench opposition in the discussion of abortion. I mean, it's going to come down to all kinds of scientific definitions of what do you mean by life and when does life begin and all this other kind of stuff.
Well, again, that's where I'm wondering, can we have a genuine general semantics approach to things? Because, part of the problem too is complexity, where if we think about the founding of the American Republic and, science is not all that far advanced at that time, although the, founders were scientifically oriented, but I mean, it's an agrarian society. So the sort of assumption that a, reasonably educated person can make decisions, and that you can elect sort of citizen representatives to go to Congress and make, debate and make these decisions, that all makes sense. But we reach this point of such technological and scientific advancement and such incredible complexity that, and I think, again, this is what Korzybski was reaching for in Manhood, is that we reach a point where the ordinary person just doesn't know enough to make a good decision. And that's where you need to yield to technical experts who really understand what's going on and have the information at hand to decide on what the best course of action would be, what would be the best policy for any given concern that comes up. So how do we deal with that kind of gap?
I guess I would say, Lance, that I think that's right. I don't think it can be like, you can't take the system, as it were, of general semantics and somehow bring it into the political realm and just apply it in mass, like at scale. No, instead it would be something like this, that each individual in their inward self-relation has to continuously practice general semantics while they're also simultaneously in their everyday conversations. It's these kinds of conversations. It's us talking. It's you talking with, again, your friends, your families, your neighbor. And that's where it's practiced. But maybe it could be practiced in the workplace in like various political, agencies, if you're in a think tank or if you're some lobbyist. But it would seem like that, even there, it's still going to happen at the level of particular people in particular places trying to use these, consciousness of abstracting, the demand for, clarity of expression and, evaluatable evidence and willingly, an ability to say, yes, my claim has been falsified and I'm going to change my position accordingly. People need to be able to do that.
Uh-huh.
The point you made a couple of minutes ago to talk about the fact that there's kind of a hierarchy of issues too. There are issues that are less complex than others, right? There are issues that require lesson with respect to, levels of abstraction to understand things, to figure them out and to come to consensus. And, Lance, when you bring up the difference, with respect to the United States between the world of the founding fathers and our world today, and talk about the fact that we've, gone past being industrial and are now, right, an information society and a service society. Well, part of the problem now, too, is that part of the technical is the means of the media of communication by which people get information and the media of communication by which people engage in politics. I mean, the idea of having serious public discourse on social media. It's such a weird, fragmented, disjointed kind of a conversation. Not to mention that what shows up are people's values and them staking their claims and arguing with one another, right? Not to mention that the algorithm also, points us to things that are going to, incite us to want to respond because we're aghast at what we're reading, right? So that part of the technical has affected our ability to have that discourse, that dialogue.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The legacy media were shaping a more, homogenized groupthink of positions in a way that this new, very dispersed, everyone's on whatever, TikTok or Instagram or Facebook or these different, X or whatnot. And I think it's so atomized and dispersed and fragmented. And this is why I thought it was sort of interesting. I saw, Robert the Kennedy Jr. is talking about stepping down, and he was saying that Ross Perot got so many all these different national spotlight presentations and 30 some of them, and he was saying that he's been sort of shut out. But then you want to go, okay, but look at we live in a very different environment today, and that then if you wanted to catch a Ross Perot, you would have to dialed into that station at that time to catch it. Now anybody, he was on Joe Rogan, or you're on some person who's got, millions of subscribers. Well, that stuff is continuously being, watched, and it's still available. So, there really is a very different media ecosystem out there today. I think politically, it's easier for people to fall into the belief that their views are widely shared without having to encounter all the different views that they don't share. Just for example, right? Like if you were to walk across the country, just literally on your two legs walking, you'd meet so many different kinds of people. They'd be radically different, right? And again, depending on how far you go and where you're going, whatnot, whereas now you can type in some, belief community, whether it's a religion or political affiliation or a brand name liking, whatever. And suddenly you're like, oh, look at it. There's people in California. There's people over here. They all think what I think. And it has this pervasiveness, but it's self-selected silos and these little reinforcing loops that create a little, tunnel reality for people that's very self-confirming and myopic and maybe not helpful for dialogue.
And in the world of user-generated content, everybody thinks that they now have a platform that makes what they, have to input, what they have to say, as important as anyone else's, which is one of the reasons why, Lance, when you talked about expertise before, one of the reasons why expertise is gone. And, again, it was Daniel Patrick Moynihan who said, everyone is entitled to their own opinion. They're just not entitled to their own facts. But, once you feel within this, this new milieu, this new media milieu, that, the fact that you can post, that you can have something to say, that you get responses, right? That changed, I think, everything. And it's one of the most important facts and factors of what social media has created for political discourse.
Well, and I think if we're looking at, the effects of various kinds of media on politics, and we go back to certainly Neil Postman's Amusing Ourselves to Death. And, even before that, Marshall McLuhan had some very interesting things to say about the role of radio and the rise of authoritarian governments in the mid-20th century. But I did want to go back, though, to the General Semantics connection, because, and it's like, how do we apply General Semantics to politics? Is there a particular kind of politics that's more in line with General Semantics? Could you have a General Semantics, could you have, say, fascism based on a General Semantics approach, or an authoritarian approach based on drawing on General Semantics? And I think, Corey, wasn't part of your motivation the fact that there are very disparate political views out there among folks who are schooled in General Semantics, and they somehow come to very different conclusions about the current political moment?
Oh, very much so. I guess so. Let me see if I can jump into that. And I think that those are great. Those are great questions. I think my own paper, my own motivation in more than just the intro, but the paper itself, and this has been a project that I've been presenting on other places, and I'm continuing to work on it. It's that I think it's to draw the connection explicitly between politics and money, or between politics and wealth, because I think the experience of what wealth is, that's like one of these mediating factors that, they shape the way we experience things like homelessness or social inequality, or just the changing, role of work and all. There's a lot of different dynamics where I feel like money is the underpinning connection to people's political sensibilities. And what I think Korzybski has done very powerfully in Manhood of Humanity, especially those chapters on wealth, capitalistic era, and survival of the fittest, is that, and you have to really look at it. I mean, he doesn't say it in exactly these words, but this is the argument. The argument is something like, once you differentiate between potential use values and kinetic use values, that is, between a thing like a relic and an artifact or a bridge or a road, that's a potential use value, and a kinetic use value. A kinetic use value is like a technique, a methodology, a procedure, a practice, and those practices are basically infinite. That is, they're not subject to the economic laws of scarcity. And once you start to get to digital representations and distribution networks for what amount to kinetic use values, now you have a wealth that is inherently outside the boundaries of traditional economic theory. That is, where you have something like, conditions of scarcity that give it value and all this kind of other stuff. Instead, everyone's in this age of superabundance. And I think if people could get that sensibility and like change in their self-understanding, they might realize they don't have to create this rat race that we've done. We've been able to admittedly have sadly, an increasing disparity between the haves and the have-nots, but the have-nots' baseline it keeps getting elevated. That is, you see homeless people with cell phones, and you see people, like it's much better to be homeless today in the U.S. than it is to be homeless, in the ancient world, or to live before, germ theory, or even at the push of a button. People today, they generally have entertainments and enjoyments and comforts and conveniences in a ways that, rival what only royalty had throughout the ages. So I think if people could appreciate that, my own sense would be that they would be less greedy, not so reductive, and able to, be better at sharing and taking turns.
But they don't have to be, based on what you're saying.
No, I think
they can be totally selfish, but people are doing fine because their level of, their living standards are just great, even if you're homeless.
No. They're living as what Korzybski calls a ghoul. And he uses the term a ghoul as someone who just consumes those values without trying to make it their obligation to perpetuate and distribute them. As people think, they take the wealth that they've fallen into, which is the living work of the dead, and then they want to argue about how to distribute it and who rightfully should have it, rather than going, it's a collective right to all of us to it, but then we all have an obligation to perpetuate and sustain those values. I think so. He says in that chapter, he says we shouldn't be either socialist or capitalist. He says both of them misunderstand the time binding element of wealth. That is, the one says, well, here, let's make sure that everyone has it. The other says, no, I'm the one who takes it because I'm stronger than you, or I was here first. Whatever. There's all these kinds of different logics. But I think Korzybski's going, what we need to do is, not like he's giving trickle-down economics, but in some way he's sort of saying you need to make sure that this wealth is spent in a way that allows it to be generating more wealth for more and more people. That's time-bound, which is science. I think for him, it's basically scientific knowledge. Unfortunately, scientific knowledge has been reduced to a kind of technocratic efficiency push. That is, like science for pure science sake and science in people's lives has been reduced to, again, a technocratic third person, like analysis of the body from the outside, rather than like a lived practice of like scientific awareness of oneself. Right. I mean, like, I think for Korzybski, there's meaningful contributions that you can make. And it has to do with his extensional theory of happiness. That's very different than, say, what's wrong with you is you need a pill for this or that and the other thing in your brain. See, I mean, I think that Korzybski's notion of science was like almost phenomenological in a way that he thought that the organism as a whole in its environment with its semantic reactions was going to physiologically affect the organism.
So how does that translate into politics, though?
I think that people are living a kind of rat race existence because they have a mistaken self-understanding. That if you can shift people's self-understanding to realize that they're not simply animals, but they're time-binding, and they're time-binding creatures, and that they enjoy a wealth that other animals don't experience, that shift makes people think about themselves and their relations to others differently.
So anyone who's against the status quo would be a positive thing from this point of view, because what you're saying is that the status quo is not satisfactory.
I guess I'm not sure what you mean by this. No, I'm saying I'm not sure.
You got somebody coming along and saying, that things are not fair the way they are. The system is rigged, and we need to have change. That would be consistent with a general semantics position, which would then open it up to people who are advocating for change from different political perspectives.
Yeah. Again, I'm sorry, I'm dropping the ball here. I'm not really giving an argument like just.
Well, I'm just trying to say, how do we account for the fact that people who are trying to approach this from with general semantics in mind come to very different political positions?
I think they can. I think there are people who are members of the Institute of General Semantics who would, even if reluctant to self-identify with a word, if pressed, they may internally, with little quotation marks around it, identify themselves as somewhat left-leaning or right-leaning or Democratic or Republican or something along those lines. Of course, qualified in a general semantics way, but equally, if the general semantics practice is to throw out scare quotes and recognize it as this is what I voted last time, and this is what I'm likely to vote here in this situation, in this context. But when we look at the pattern, we do. I mean, I think there's so in those senses, we can have people who are vigilantly and diligently practicing general semantics while they're both having very different political parties and political orientations.
I want to stay on the point, but I want to refer to, I guess, what I wrote about, and it's interesting. I'm thinking about how it connects to what Corey wrote in his article, and we're writing at the same time, and I had no idea what he was doing. Right? And it's coming out of this conversation as we talk about socialism versus capitalism, as we talk about right versus left, as we talk about power versus not, as we talk about abundance versus, not so much or very little, which I guess is more than a two-valued orientation there. There is, the somewhere in the middle of it all. But we fall back on those kinds of pairings to talk about power, to talk about people's values. And, so when I was writing my piece, it was about the idea that the political system in the United States sort of has evolved in a way that keeps people from having to have a dialogue, keeps people from having to think, keeps people from having to form themselves, because they basically decide their politics on the basis of values, whether it, my father was a Republican and so I am, or my father was a Republican and I'm rebelling against my father and I'm going the other way, right? And so we fall into, because we have a two-party system, and it makes it easy to, have the tug of war, the sports contest, who wins, right? Who's going to win the election coming up, right? That's a problem. And so what I wrote about is I said, well, maybe the kind of system that, the Europeans have, right, with a parliamentary system is better because it's not one side versus other. It's all of these pillars all line up and they duke it out amongst, the whole group. But Corey, it comes back to exactly what you said in the first place, that money is still the object, right? Money is still what is at the root of who is in power, why, and that this has always been. And when you think in terms of time binding, if this is the way that things have always been, who has and who doesn't on that sliding scale that is not really too valued, what do we do to change that? What do we do to fix that? What role does a general semantics orientation have to say, that what have we learned from this over all of this time that would be more fair? I think of Galbraith, and I don't remember the quote exactly. I wish I did. John Kenneth Galbraith talking about how the modern conservative thinker is engaged in the time-worn practice of trying to come up with a moral justification for selfishness, right? Versus people who would say, we need to think about the polity. We need to think about the good of everyone. We're all in this together. And so can general semantics in some way help us in the way that we've supposedly been learning over, the history of our civilization to make things better? I don't know. I don't.
No, again, I thought your piece was great. I mean, I just echoing sort of what you're saying there. I mean, I think on this overcoming the dichotomization and challenging the two-party orientation, I mean, I think you're referencing of things like the Tea Party and the other things that are going on. Like, look at the way that each party is internally fragmented in various ways. So it's made of little sub-parties. But I think if one were going to be scientific about it, let's do the actual data. I think that as strange bedfellows as they are, like the pro, Second Amendment folks with the pro-life folks, there are some odd gatherings of groups, like, for example, the Republican Party. But I think Republican Party is actually much more laser focused. It's more unified, despite how fractious it is with contestation. Whereas the Democratic Party is this consortium, a blanket of all these different interests and all these different programs, many different protests. I mean, internally and externally, it's a much larger, rangier tent of a much more, and yet, I think from the convention anyway, they pulled off something more more inward unity. And so I think in some way, the two-party system, it gets used rhetorically in different ways. Sometimes we talk up the two-party system in order to pledge allegiance to our party, but then it also just breaks apart and it starts to reassemble at different levels of abstraction. So again, I think the ability to fluidly go back and forth between levels of abstraction of what we're talking about, I think these are, again, some of the resources that general semantics offers.
It's funny teaching this stuff. I talk about how when in the United States, when the Fairness Doctrine was repealed, right, that was the opening for conservative talk radio. That was the launching pad for, Rush Limbaugh and his platform, which was huge. And maybe not as big as, we would think in terms of actual, numbers of listeners and how long they listen to the show. But that happened. And my point, though, is that, and along later comes a group of folks. Al Franken was one of them. Janine Garofalo was another one. And they create this radio network called Air America, which was going to be the, left of center foil to conservative talk radio. And it died. It went nowhere. And, I'm trying to explain this to younger people. And I'm saying, well, it's because, the people on the left of center tend to be the kind of people who just want to talk about things, and they're not going to be ideological and hitting on those talking points. They're going to have this conversation that just doesn't have the effect that rhetorical use of sloganeering and ideology, hammering the talking points has.
Sure. Yeah.
I'm just wondering because, and let's be upfront and fair that the three of us are all kind of, relatively similar in our politics, that is, in terms of being, I'm
getting more conservative by the day. I'm getting older.
Well, yeah, but still, tend to be, let's say liberal Democrat, democratic politics, whether it's, I agree with you that I feel less identity with progressive politics right now than I have in the past, but that's our leaning. And so, Thom, when you mentioned conservatives before as being about selfishness, I think that's someone who was associated with the conservative political view would take issue with that. So again, I'm kind of wondering if we're biased in some way in this approach, and if we can hold that back and think, is there something in general semantics that allows for a conservative point of view as opposed to a liberal point of view? And again, because we know that there are quite a few folks out there associated with general semantics who are conservatives and who subscribe to conservative politics.
But Lance, I don't think this is that difficult. I mean, if someone says that they're a Democrat, it's not like saying this pen is black or this pen is, the word is the trouble there, that we're not the substance, we're not, attributing some sort of essence. I think we're saying, according to particular history of practices this person has in the past done X, Y, or Z, with their voting or whatever, their participation in political process. But I think if people are doing that, you could certainly have a person self-identify as roughly a Republican or a Democrat, and yet they do it with scare quotes, and they say, this is how I'm feeling at present. And, it's not. So I think there are ways of giving conditionality to one's views, realizing the map is not the territory, and that's still going, I am aligned with this. But I don't think that, I guess to just maybe blanketly answer, I don't think that a general semantics position necessitates anything other than a radical questioning of those kinds of positions like capitalism or socialism or anything like that.
Mm-hmm.
To go back to my mangling of the Galbraith quote, he was talking about economic conservatism versus social conservatism. But of course, again, that's, dividing it up in a two-valued kind of way. And really, we could talk about conservatism on all kinds of issues and particular policies. So, with respect to where people on the conservative side of the fence stand, if they recognize the basis upon which, the values upon which they take those stances and pursue a line of thinking, that again, I'm certainly willing to have a conversation with those kinds of conservatives, and I love to have those kinds of talks with people who are thoughtful and informed and who I can learn from, right? Absolutely. And by the way, just to go back to you trying to, define the similarities in our politics, I will point out that I am a registered independent, which in New York State only means that I can't vote in primaries. But the reason that I'm an independent is I'm not a libertarian independent. I am a true independent. I would not, as Groucho Marx said, be a member of a party that would, have a member of a club that would have me as a member, right?
Right.
Yeah. I guess I want to go back to Lance. I think your original driving point was something along the lines, and it was bouncing from the question that Thom had raised from my intro, which is, could people who are really well versed look at an exact same issue and come to different political whatever is, and I think, and Thom right here just sort of said, well, there's a whole bunch of different issues and different, depends on the particular policies. And somebody might be, well, I'm fiscally a conservative, or I'm socially a liberal. They're going to give all these sort of different ways of talking about it in different contexts in different ways. So I think just, those kinds of resources are partly what the deal is. But I would go back to take something like the structural differential, right? When Korzybski made them and he carried them around and he had the little strings that you'd actually pop into the object and then you'd put a different label on. And I think that's where he came up with this is part of the et cetera as well. So not only do you never talk about anything completely, but when you identify this aspect of the object, you're describing it this way and you lead to inference one. But when you connect on to this point in the object, now you have a different description and a different inference. And when they're all funneling back to that, the parabola at the top, I don't think you ever get to, we've exhaustively talked about it. Now we have the one scientific way to chase out a policy. Not only are we playing ball on running water, but we're always caught with partial abstractions, and we're always partly caught with, partial following outs of the various inferences from the very particular parts that we picked.
There's this piece too that I think we've left out, which is when people have a particular issue that becomes the driving force in their politics, right? The Catholics who are deeply against abortion, for instance, they then choose their side in the United States in a two-party system based upon that, one issue. Their politics is a one-trick pony. And I find that fascinating, because what I would say is, well, okay, so take that stance on that issue, but let's talk about the other ones, and do they all line up for you, right? How could you be anti-abortion and for the death penalty, right?
Thom, are you saying there should be a completely different political process? Instead of parties, you have just nothing but policies, that people vote on policies? Get rid of the electoral college, go popular vote on policies rather than politicians and parties. You just go toward platforms and policies that have been advocated on behalf of the people.
I mean, we have to have a system, right? We have to, and this is where it gets a little technical, a little technocratic, obviously. If we really have a representative democracy, right? And the elected and appointed officials represent our will. Well, again, first of all, it's never, the majority is 50.1%, right? Or 50.0999 repeating percent. In this kind of a system, why do we have an electoral college? Well, because of the idea that the masses are a mob. The masses are uninformed. The masses can't make the decision in the ways that we say, well, you have to understand facts and you have to, follow all of the web of ways of thinking about the facts that come to bear on an issue. The founding fathers recreated democracy based upon the Athenian ideal and took it a step further in an incredibly audacious act of time binding. And it's a created system by which we have continued to try to do the right thing and make things better for all of us, or, again, the folks in power make things better for themselves. I don't know, if there's a next step, a better political system. I don't know if the science of thinking toward that, brings us any closer, brings us any further. I don't know.
I want to go back to Lance's question, because I'm more vexed by it. Because I think, what if I say, we're not really getting full disclosure of the facts behind the machinations of things. That needs to be discussed.
Right.
Doesn't, which party, and I don't want to say either one, people can do the math themselves, but which party has more effectively and aggressively used, and why the gerrymandering of a particular, and why is that not talked about more? Or why the strategic misnaming? Which party has been more effective in strategically misnaming things to push them through? Everything from Right to Work or Citizens United. I mean, it seems like we'd have to really study the actual processes. I think it would be a great policy to say, you cannot legally, on a mass network or on a mass mediated message, send an ad that misrepresents or even talks about an opponent. Your only ad can be what your positions are and what you believe. But to sit and spend millions and millions of dollars of saying what the other person thinks, but you're misrepresenting their view, it's weird. I mean, the number of videos of either party sort of saying what the other party thinks. No, I just want to hear what your party thinks.
Yeah, there's certainly a point to that, but that comes in direct conflict with freedom of speech, which is kind of a bedrock concept for the Republic, and it does speak to that idea of the free marketplace of ideas that democracy is supposed to be based on. But what you're part of what we've been getting at, I've been thinking, because, of course, a while back, I did an episode of Semantic Reactions with Steve Stockdale, which I'm sure you both listened to because you listen to this podcast religiously. And he came up with that concept, I guess this was back in the 90s, of calling out the symbol rulers, that was sort of his phrase for applying general semantics as a kind of critical analysis of political discourse. And so if we're calling out the symbol rulers, calling out the people in charge, and that goes to not one party or the other, but to the people in power and how they control our discourse. And that does kind of open it up to a lot of liberal discourse as well as conservative discourse in the way that things are talked about.
I don't think I was suggesting a clamp down on freedom of speech. I mean, there's all kinds of laws that apply to campaign contributions, the transparency of whatnot. I mean, there's all this, who can make a contribution. But I guess what I'm trying to say is that I think donor money or, money that's being spent on political campaign by national candidates should be subject to stricter policies. And if people want to shoot a YouTube and rant this, that, and the other thing, and they want to say whatever their opinion is about that, yeah, go ahead and do that. But I feel like it's in the best interest of a democratic population. It would be much better for people to really be haggling about policies and in an open, candid way. Like, I've heard both parties accuse the other party of going to be ending Social Security. Now, why can't either one just come out and say what their position is?
Mm-hmm. Because it's boring. I want to introduce this because, sort of like we're kind of coming to it from the general semantics perspective. Then, you say we should be based on facts, and then there's the kind of debaters' criteria here. What is the problem, which was Neil Postman's great question. What is the problem that this is supposed to solve, addressed to technology? But the debaters' criteria for, in terms of a debate is, if you're advocating for change, what is the reason for the change? Is this a problem that needs to be addressed? And then does your solution address that problem? And is it the best way to address that problem? So, so all of that goes to the sort of traditional criteria. Now, on the other side of things, you get someone like George Lakoff comes to mind for me. The folks who have been sort of like building on his work, the Frame Lab, which is really like wonderful stuff, brilliant stuff. But, the basis of it all is that people do not vote for policy. It doesn't make any bit of difference. And if you want to be successful at politics, you have to speak to values and you have to speak to that emotional connection. And, in a sense, that's what we're seeing here from both parties now, that they are trying to frame things in terms of fundamental values. And that when we've had sort of policy wonks, if you like, running, as candidates, they tend to not do very well because people just don't vote based on politics. And we say people vote based on identity politics. That's comes down to what the identity that connects to your values as well. And that is, kind of the fundamental problem then. Do you stick to kind of facts and policy at the cost of winning elections, or do you do what's needed to win elections in order to get what you feel to be rational and appropriate policies in place?
You need to do both. You got to do both there. It's a both and,
Well, but again, what it comes down to is not necessarily thinking about the polity, but thinking about winning, thinking about politics as careerism, thinking about power and staying in power, right? When the Republican Party talks about the idea of small government, yeah, but they still want to be in power in government, and and be controlling the purse strings and making decisions about what should be privatized as opposed to being under governmental control and regulation control. But you brought up debate just a minute ago, Lance, and I'm thinking about the model of debate. To me, is again the same thing. It's about winning, right? If I'm going to listen to a debate, is it about me deciding who's right and who won, or is it about me listening to people duke it out with respect to, competing ideas and ways of thinking and degrees of informedness about what they're, where they're coming from, and learning from that rather than saying, oh yeah, that woman won.
Yeah. I mean, I think go to climate change. I think climate change is such an exemplar here. I think there really there are a great number of scientists who are pretty much in agreement that not only is there change, but it's humanly accelerated. It's not the sole cause, but there are, factory farms. There's all kinds of other things that are related to this. And I think some people, they're more interested in their messaging, and they're ready to spread misinformation to win an election rather than to belly up to the bar and go, look, this is something that we're going to have to take seriously, and we're going to have to deal with it in terms of policy.
Mm-hmm. It would be really
inconvenient for people, but it's, I think sometimes, it's the Mark Twain line of, right, it's easier to fool people than to convince them they've been fooled. And once they build years of practice in a denial of something, well, now they're entrenched there.
It would be really interesting to have Korzybski as an applied scientist around now to weigh in on climate change, right? I wonder how he would approach it. I wonder what he would say.
I mean, there can be, their own forces of geological change and climate change that isn't human created. Fair enough, but that doesn't mean there can't be both. There can be natural changes, but also human activity that's a sort of either or that people position in is so highly problematic.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, let me shift back to the special issues because, what do you think about, how do you feel about what you've accomplished with these two issues, and how, what stands out for you as, as far as this project was concerned?
Oh, for me, I'm very grateful for all the work and assistance that Thom has done. I'm so happy for the contributions I've received. I think they really hang together. There's a lot of interconnection between the pieces. I'm looking forward to working with Thom and trying to get this, as a co-edited book out, hopefully, I don't know, beginning of 2025. I think we're going to have to maybe do a little bit of a further intro on this, its history and sort of what's been happening in the political environment.
Yeah.
Now a little bit of update. And, I think it's because it's an election year, it's a good time to, even in talking about it, do it as, with a date. And here's what's going on right now in 2025. And we'll see, how things continue. And whatever happens, we're going to have to just see how this is going to unfold, I think from my own perspective, and this came from, Valerie and I, we watched a lot of the DNC, or at least parts of it. And, I think there is a concern that Harris is maybe, domestically good, but a little bit internationally hawkish. So, I think there are people who have, various concerns, which I think are good. But we'll have to see. The world's become a pretty volatile place. I think the world is really, there's a lot going on that internationally we could be more or less involved with. And those are difficult policies on international involvement in things. I don't know what kind of facts you're going to render in order to get people to just again. And I know we just sort of talked that we need more than the facts and whatnot. We need to appeal to identities and whatnot. But I think the overall sense is that the world is going to be it's going to be a troubling next decade at the least, especially with all this AI stuff.
Mm-hmm.
I think that there's nothing more important that GSers can be discussing and trying to get a bead on with respect to what we can do to help. And it's one thing to say it's special issues on GS and politics. It's going to be a book on GS and politics, but everything else that's that is part of that discussion, talking about, again, the role of money, the rise of authoritarianism, the problems of war in Ukraine and in Israel and Gaza, the climate change issue, racism, all of these things are part and parcel of what we're talking about when we talk about political stances, political decision makings that affect us all, regardless of what our personal politics are or what's going on in the realm of politics in action and those in power, right? So, what else should we be doing and talking about and writing about and thinking about?
I mean, I think just to echo some of that too, I think that it's not as if anyone who wants to get involved in the Institute or people who want to learn about general semantics are somehow going to be led or leaned either left or right. But I think for people who want to have the ability to discuss with someone on the other side of the aisle or who's in a different view, I think GS is giving amazing resources for, again, delaying reactions, systematically sort of thinking about what was said, what were the evidence, how abstract are we thinking, how do we think in more specific terms. So again, I think it's more for resources for helping people create context of dialogue between and across parties rather than as, here's how to align with one party or another.
And let me make this sales pitch too. I mean, you guys are incredibly engaging, elegant writers. We've got Gary Gumpert and Susan Drucker. We've got Chris Mayer. We've got Ryan McCullough. We've got Marty Levinson. I mean, again, these
Martinez, there's some good stuff in there.
Yeah. You pick up these issues, and it's not this arcane, kind of thing that people would expect out of, a scholarly journal. And not only is what we're writing about important, but the ways in which you guys write is readable and really, I think, helpful in that regard to engage people in what we're trying to do.
Well, let me ask you, since you mentioned some of the contributors to the issues, what, if anything, was surprising about, you put out the call for papers for special issue and you got enough for 2. But I mean, apart from quantity, what, if anything, was surprising about what you received from folks? Was there anything that surprised you that you didn't expect?
Well, I'll just say again, I thought they were all great in their own ways and making contributions. So I was thrilled by the collection and sort of the synergy between some of the pieces and whatnot. But again, Lance, I've said it before we started this, I really think you did an amazing job at bringing general semantics and media ecology, weaving them together with this encyclopedic command and this big history that is I think, just created a wonderful context for broadly thinking about why political discussions they were not only tenuous, because of the fragility of the kinds of, I guess, knowledge and communication that comes out of literacy. But as those things wane, this becomes more and more, again, a double bind, as it were, a very difficult prospect. And so I don't think your piece is particularly upbeat. Sobering, but I thought it was just really a great contribution in overall trying to understand the big history of how we came to believe in democracy and now are coming to question whether or not that was ever even justified or how much it could ever be justified, if it would be accomplishable at all in the future.
And Lance, I don't just put you up front in issues, because you're the president of the IGS. And it's interesting that you're the lead article in the second issue, not in the first one, because you weren't done yet. And obviously, in reading it, we see why it took you some time to work it out and work on that piece. So, it belongs as the lead article in that issue for sure.
Well, I did appreciate the opportunity to think about and work on that problem, and thank you for your kind words. Let me ask then, was there anything that you had hoped to get, or any kind of subjects or kinds of things that you'd hope to get that you did not receive, that you would have liked to have been able to include? Because, and we do special issues or anthologies on a particular topic, and we're hoping to get certain things, and we don't always get what we're looking for.
Yeah.
We may get things we weren't looking for, which may be good or not. But were there things you were looking for that you were sort of disappointed that you didn't receive?
Gender.
Go ahead, Tom.
That's the first thing that comes to my mind.
What was that?
Gender is the first thing that comes to my mind. There's nothing about gender politics where we're heavy on guys, right? And I think we need that perspective. And
say that as well. This is sort of in reference even to your piece, Lance. Is that I think there are very interesting stories. I mean, you mention it in passing about the limitations of age, race, and sex, this kind of stuff. But like to really put the big history, in some way, the kind of promise of democracy for women, like it happened more and more later in the 20th century, not only as more and more women went to college and became literate, but as reliable contraception happened. And I think that's part of, the women entering the workforce as equal, having more control over their reproductivity, having a very different sense of self that's been fostered by explicit, extended education and literacy. All of those things have been massively disruptive to male identity, to senses of, prospects of the future, and how does the family work, and, what's the best way to have children, and should you have a nanny? Does somebody need to stay home? So I think we're still in the wake of a lot of like instability that's been created from not only the changing role of women in the environment, but the sort of social political wake that all that has created. I mean, there's so many different things that's related to.
I was just reading Heather Cox Richardson the other day. I read her pretty religiously, and she reminded us that, Black and African American male suffrage came before women's suffrage, right? I forget by how many years, but yeah.
1973 is when women in the U.S. were allowed to open a bank account in their own name.
Yeah, and we still never passed the Equal Rights Amendment.
Yeah. So I thought, I agree. I think some more specific, I would have liked. There were some people who I don't need to reference, but there are people who are a wider range of political stripe who I would have liked to have seen them maybe weigh in on a particular policy or a particular issue. I think, bringing the GS expertise to it, I think that could have been nice, but, I tried to do a lot of outreach, and we tried to, we put the call out. So I was still all said and done very happy with no disappointments, but yeah, there could have been some benefits from some other people maybe adding things in.
Yeah, and I don't think, there's any kind of, liberal slant to it, or, given what Lance was saying about the three of us or the two of us as co-editors. I absolutely, again, a thoughtful piece. I would be interested to read it regardless of where the person is coming from. That's the point.
Okay. And we just got through the Democratic convention, as was mentioned. What are your views on this political season? We're about to enter the end game, so to speak. No Avengers, hopefully, but we're in this sort of last leg of the current presidential election in the United States, which has ramifications not just domestically but globally. What are your thoughts about the way this has been run so far?
Boy, I don't know. I don't really have a weigh-in on any of that. I would just say that I would like it if as many people who are eligible to vote. I mean, people need to get out there. I think this is a time of possible, slide one way or the other. I think either party seems to think the other party is going to go in a very bad direction. And I think it's sad that we can't, collectively say we all want something like thriving. We want something like, avoiding unnecessary misery. But it does become so partisan so quickly. But just trying to get as many people to vote and to get their interests and, represented, and we'll see what happens. I'm not optimistic about this being like a technologically glitch free. I think it's going to be filled with accusations of errors and other problems. Like I think the process itself is what's most concerning to me, that people have been, sort of taught to now distrust the legitimacy of how the practice. I've seen videos now claiming that either party is stacking the deck in a preemptive way and, all this kind of stuff.
The extent to which there is so much divisiveness, and I don't just mean in this country. Again, I think if GS can help, it would be to get us all to be more willing to listen to and to understand each other in open-minded kinds of ways. I'm reading just over the last couple of days that there seems to be a spike where young people, maybe, Corey, will do exactly what you said, which is, step up and vote more than they have in the past. I remember with the Clinton election, MTV played a role, and with the Obama election, social media played a role. And now I think, again, the fact that we have a woman and a person of color, maybe that's playing a role. I'm not going to say that, it's a media matter in the way I just referred to Clinton and Obama's campaigns and election. But again, I would like to see more unity, that we are, again, all in this together as people living on the planet in 2025 in the face of everything that's sad and tragic and catastrophic going on around us. Again, that to me, I guess, when I talked about what was important about what we did in putting these two issues together, it would be to soften up and reduce the amount of divisive politics among people like us.
Yeah.
I do want to say that, from my part, that while I'm, from my partisan point of view, this has been a roller coaster, and, as a registered Democrat, I'm certainly very happy about the more past month and the way things have turned. But, in terms of analysis, I mean, going back to Daniel Borsten's The Image and Neil Postman's Amusing Ourselves to Death, and I'll just throw in that I did my follow-up to Postman with Amazing Ourselves to Death. And having watched both the Republican and the Democratic conventions, it is so much, has gone so far in that direction for both of them. To see Hulk Hogan, for example, prominently in the Republican convention, to see Oprah Winfrey with the Democratic convention, Kid Rock versus whatever that DJ, I don't recall his name, but
Stevie Wonder. Stevie Wonder.
Oh, well, Stevie Wonder. Yeah. I mean, it was great television. They're doing great television. And they understand that that's the job. So I'm, again, I'm pleased that my side is doing well at, working with the medium. And, you hear about, them doing well with TikTok, for example, which I don't really follow myself, but I mean, I'm happy about that, from the partisan part of me, that half of, that's my left brain, if you like, but my right brain is saying that we're all screwed, with the way things are going, and that this is, we're not finding a way out of this and into rational political discourse that we're supposed to, democracy is supposed to be based upon, and where we're talking about policy relating to facts and all of that. So, it's a kind of divided sense for me, but it's certainly, and that's where it just seems paradoxical in a way, if not, certainly conflicted.
I wrote a piece in Et Cetera a bunch of years back about, I called it the culture of personality, and referring to Korzybski and referring to, Postman, and, the fact, Lance, that you and I come out of the medicology program under Postman, and, talk about the post-maniacs, right? And I wonder about the cult of personality of Trump. And, once he's out of the political picture, and I'm not suggesting when that may be, but once he is, that will matter. And I know, again, we're trying to not talk about personality in that way in the course of this little podcast, but I think about it with respect to Howard Stern. Again, when I'm teaching in my media-based program, and I say, Howard Stern is the franchise at Sirius XM, but when Howard Stern, retires or dies, gets hit by a bus or whatever, is there going to be someone to come along and replace him in that regard, right? Because it's the person and what he's been able to do more so than this kind of shock jock talk radio, which are a dime a dozen in morning drive time across the nation. And so, what will it mean when you remove this cult of personality from the equation?
Charisma is a funny thing. Charisma is very strange.
Well, McLuhan said charisma was looking like everybody else. And there was that sense about, let's say like Napoleon, for example, was just like a sort of a man of the people, if you like, that he was, in contrast to sort of aristocrats or nobles. And it could be said about Trump as well, in this, certainly in his opposition to perceived Eastern elites, Ivy League types that, it seems like just somebody who is a regular person in terms of his tastes and sensibilities, or relates to at least a large chunk of that. I do think, what is interesting and perhaps encouraging is seeing that something like Kamala Harris's blended family, for example, or Tim Walls's son having having these developmental disabilities, that seems to also be like a lot of us out there, a lot of people out there. So that, that becomes a question of who, if we look at Kenneth Burke's sort of inversion of General Semantics, where its rhetoric is all about identification, who do we identify with? Who do we see as like us? That's out there, and that raises a very interesting question, and maybe a hopeful one, because if we can see, I think the fact that enough Americans saw Barack Obama as, we're able to identify with him and not see him as other, but see him as like us. I think that was enormously encouraging about, from a progressive point of view. And I hope that this is the case now. I'm sorry.
Well, just to say on that point, I think this is where, because Biden stepped down, there was, not only a massive ability for more people to identify, but I think one of the things that happened there is that, so the Trump party is, I don't want to say revivalist, but make America great again, kind of like harkens back to the past. And then I think that can work when the candidate is very young. If it's a young candidate and they're in opposition to an older candidate and they're going to give a revivalist move, I think it works. But when he's given revivalist and he's now the older candidate, the messaging is somehow now, it doesn't resonate in the right way. And that he had so many attacks on basically an ageist alignment. And now that's starting to stick back at him because he made that as a salient feature in all of his followers' minds. And so there's like a cognitive dissonance now. So I think some of that stuff is going to be, it'll be interesting to see how it all plays out. I don't think anyone could predict right now with complete accuracy what's going to happen. I think there's still a lot to happen. I think the debate that's coming up will have some people make up their minds. Probably not many, but I think independents out there will probably go, this is where I'm going to.
It's interesting you bring that up because it makes you think like Daniel Boorstin kind of bemoaned the loss of greatness, that we could never have great heroes again because we know, they're sort of been brought down to off their pedestal by too much information, essentially. And Boorstin was a Republican. He was not a kind of MAGA or even Reaganite, as far as I know. I mean, he was more of a Gerald Ford sort of centrist type of Republican conservative, but, cultural conservative and, very much, about America exceptionalism, Jefferson and all of that. And then you get to our friend Joshua Marowitz, who writes about how the electronic media have brought us to the point where you can never have a great leader again. You can never have, say, a Roosevelt again, or even an Eisenhower, and that Reagan was nothing like them because all of his foibles and personal, qualities were all laid out in front of us. But for Meyerowitz, who was very, very much in the kind of leftist progressive camp, that's a good thing, right? That the great man is a calamity for democracy. And, the whole point of democracy is to have, I like Emerson's phrase, representative men. I mean, aside from the sexism of it, but, people who are representative of us, who are one of us, not standing above us. So what do you think? Maybe to close things off, because this has been a wonderful discussion. I know we could probably go on for hours on this, and maybe we'll follow it up at a later date. But, what do you think for the future? And not just short term, but, long term, what do you think, what are the prospects for politics in the future, looking down the road, from where we are today?
Well, again, and Lance, I know you read her too. I've been reading Heather Cox Richardson's Letters from an American pretty much since she started doing it back in 2019. What it reminds me of, right? So for those of you who don't know her, she's a historian up at Boston College, and her expertise is the period leading up to the Civil War, through the Civil War, and into the Reconstruction. And she interprets our time based upon her expertise. But what has rung so strongly about it for me is it harkens back to Postman's thermostatic view of education, which is to say that history doesn't happen. First off, we don't necessarily, learn from history, right? Santayana and a whole bunch of others. But history doesn't happen in cycles. What happens is it's almost like a seesaw, that when things lean too far in one direction, there is a countervailing, weight that sends it back in the opposite direction. And obviously, we're looking for balance and we're looking for stasis, I think, in most of what we've talked about. But since, really, since Roosevelt, there has been a push away from the idea of thinking about all, right, the pluribus unum, to thinking about the what will help those in power maintain their power and run things and control things, because of this idea that there are some people who are better than others. There are some people who, there's a hierarchy. And I think that I see the seesaw tilting back in the other direction. Now, whether or not that will come to be, I have no idea. Whether it will happen for an extended period of time, I have no idea. To what extent it will, lean us back, too far in the other direction, and then, we wind up then having to tilt it back. I don't know how strong, how powerful that movement will be, if it even has any effect at all.
Yeah, my own sense here, and again, I don't want to be like ominous or anything, but it seems like the acceleration of AI coupled with the increasing international instability, it's going to create conditions that are going to be make or break for whoever is at the helm. And so it could be really just again a career making or breaking event for whoever is. I think there's a lot of stuff that's going to happen here in the next couple of years. I think we're really at an accelerated cultural change. It's not just information overload; it's temporal compression. I think when I used to teach, I could leave the students on Thursday, and then I'd see them on Tuesday and kind of pick up where we left off. Today, there's like a different person in that room. That is just in the course of 5 days, they've watched so many TikToks and they've seen so many commercials and so much stuff that there's an accelerating rate of information overload. And I think that the AI is just going to worsen that. And it also puts people in a tighter gearing with international events. And I'm not sure. I mean, I think that, as I said, it may be that either candidate is going to have their hands full with some serious international crises. And it's going to be what happened, and then we're going to make a decision of whether that was good or not.
Sounds like you're talking about future shock.
Yeah, right. Oh, right.
Rating change.
Yeah, exactly. Oh, for sure.
And I know we're wrapping up, Corey, but that's, to think about AI on both sides of the political coin, right? To think about it with respect to, the average voter, the average citizen, and what he or she or they understand about the impact of this in their lives, what they understand about even what it is. And then on the side of those who are in power, do they have experts working for them, as their advisors, as their staff, who are able to really negotiate and shape and mold these kinds of advances in ways that will become a program for success?
Yeah, no, I completely agree. This is it's opening like a Pandora's box of all kinds of stuff we didn't even talk about. But I mean, all the control of corporations and transnational as these billionaire class in various ways. I saw a thing with Mark Cuban talking about Gemini and Microsoft Word, and he was saying that he's able to use Gemini to bring together like these billionaires from all around the world, and they can accomplish now in like a 2 or 3 hour meeting what would have taken weeks to do previously. And so as these AI systems really accelerate people's capacity to have lifetime spontaneous translation, you're going to watch a lot of corporate growth and potentially transnational, international kinds of corporate influence into a lot of politics global.
Well, we have, on the one hand, the accelerating change, and yet on the other hand, the pendulum swinging back and forth. And of course, if you put them both together, you get a spiral or a vortex or a maelstrom. And, then the question is, to borrow from, Marshall McLuhan, who loved Edgar Allan Poe's story, A Descent into the Maelstrom, you're looking into the sort of chaos of the environment and trying to find the pattern that connects, to make sense out of it, to recognize the pattern. And I think one thing that we can certainly say for certain is that General Semantics can help us in finding the patterns and in making sense out of all the nonsense and finding order within that chaos. So the one thing that we can point to and that we continue to work for is General Semantics based education to help people, in whatever we're doing, whatever approach we're taking, but to be more rational, fact-based, reality testing, and sane, dare we say, saner in our approach to politics. Really, Corey and Thom, I think we're all very grateful for these two wonderful issues that you've put together. They really have been fantastic, and I think we're all looking forward to the book, the anthology that will be based on these, and as you said, will include some more contributions to round it out. I think that these are all been very important and have opened up a kind of dialogue, as we have continued to have here on this podcast. But within our conferences and symposiums, within the journal, etc., and within all of our work, opened up a kind of dialogue that will continue for a long time to come. So thank you very much for this dialogue today, and for the work on those edited collections.
Thank you, Lance, and thank you, Thom. Really, it was great to work with you, and I was happy to get the collection together. So I'm looking forward to the book.
Yeah, thank you both too, and this was real fun to just talk about all of it. So thanks.
You've been listening to our August 2024 episode of Semantic Reactions, featuring Corey Anton, Thom Gencarelli, and Lance Strate talking about politics and general semantics. If you like what you've heard, or even if you haven't, please consider becoming a member of the Institute of General Semantics if you're not one already. In addition to supporting our efforts, IGS members receive an annual subscription to our journal, etc., a review of general semantics, access to our online and in-person events, lectures, and seminars, and discounts on the books and audiovisual materials that we sell. Regular membership is only $50 and half off for students. Your membership and any additional donations you care to make will help to support our offerings and activities as we work to bring a measure of sanity to the world. The Institute of General Semantics is a 501c3 nonprofit organization dedicated to research and education on a wide range of topics. They include language and symbols, meaning and perception, communication and representation, media and technology, science and epistemology, creativity, and critical thinking. We are dedicated to making the world a better place through practical strategies for improving our semantic environment, individually and collectively. For more information about the Institute and our activities, and to become a member and supporter of our work, please visit our website at generalsemantics.org. That's generalsemantics, one word, .org. And this brings to a close our 24th episode of Semantic Reactions, the official podcast of the Institute of General Semantics. This is Ben Houck, signing off, saying, we hope you'll join us next time. And until then, just remember this simple fact, that the map is not the territory.